The idea of bringing IOSS into being arose at the 1957 Bilderberger meeting. It will be recalled that the Bilderberger Conference is a creation of M16 under the direction of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The idea came from Alistair Buchan, son of Lord Tweedsmuir. Buchan was chairman at the time and a board member of the RIIA and a member of the Round Table, reportedly very close to the British royal family. This was the same conference that welcomed Labour Party leader Denis Healey to its ranks. Others in attendance were François Duchesne, whose mentor, Jean-Monnet Duchesne, ran the Trilateral Commission under the tutelage of H.V. Dix from Tavistock's Columbus Center. Among the governing council of this gigantic propaganda opinion-making apparat is included the following: Frank Kitson, a one-time controller of the IRA Provisionals, the man who started the Mau Mau insurgency in Kenya; Lazard Frères, represented by Robert Ellsworth; N.M. Rothschild, represented by John Loudon; Paul Nitze, representative of Schroeder Bank. Nitze has played a very prominent and substantial role in matters of arms control agreements, which have always been under the direction of the RIIA, C.L. Sulzberger of the New York Times, Stansfield Turner, a former director of the CIA, Peter Calvacaresi, representing Penguin Books, Royal Institute for International Affairs, represented by Andrew Schoenberg, columnists and reporters, represented by Flora Lewis, Drew Middleton, Anthony Lewis, Max Frankel, Daniel Ellsberg, Henry Kissinger, Robert Bowie, a former director of the CLA's National Intelligence Estimates. Flowing from the 1957 Bilderberger meeting, Kissinger was instructed to open a round-table office in Manhattan, the nucleus of which consisted of Haig, Ellsberg, Halperin, Schlesinger, McNamara, and the McBundy brothers. Kissinger was directed to fill all executive positions in the Nixon administration with roundtablers, loyal to the RIIA and therefore to the Queen of England. It was no accident that Kissinger chose President Nixon's old hangout, the Hotel Pierre, as his center of operations. The significance of the Round Table Kissinger operation was thus: on orders of the RIIA chairman Andrew Schoenberg, a block was placed on all agencies involved in intelligence, preventing them from giving information to President Nixon. This meant Kissinger and his staff were getting all intelligence, foreign and domestic, law enforcement information, including FBI Division 5, before any of it was released to the president. This made certain that all M16-controlled terrorist operations in the U.S. would have no chance of being leaked. This was Halperin's bailiwick. By working this methodology, Kissinger at once established hegemony over the Nixon presidency, and after Nixon was disgraced by the Kissinger Group and hounded from office, Kissinger emerged with unprecedented powers such as have not been equaled before or since Watergate. Some of these seldom enumerated powers included the following. Kissinger ordered National Security Decision Memorandum No. I to be drafted by Halperin, who got the actual wording directly from the RIIA through round-table circles. The memorandum appointed Kissinger as the supreme U.S. authority, chairman of the verification panel. All SALT negotiations were directed from here, using Paul Nitze, Paul Warnke, and a nest of traitors inside the arms control mission at Geneva. In addition, Kissinger was appointed to the Vietnam Special Studies Group, which oversaw and made evaluations of all reports, civilian and military, including intelligence reports coming out of Vietnam. Kissinger also demanded and got oversight of the 40 Committee, a super-secret agency that has the task of deciding when and where to initiate covert activities and then monitors the progress of operations it sets in motion. Meantime, Kissinger ordered a blizzard of wiretaps by the FBI, even on his closest assistants, so as to give the impression that he was on top of everything. Most of his circle were told that wiretaps on them were in force. This nearly backfired was an M16 operative by the name of Henry Brandon was ordered wiretapped, but was not informed by Kissinger. Brandon was doubling as a reporter for the London Times, and Kissinger very nearly got thrown out because nobody does this to the London Times. The full story of the Ellsberg break-in and the subsequent Watergating of Nixon is too long to be included here. Suffice to say, Kissinger had control of Ellsberg from the day that Ellsberg was recruited while at Cambridge. Ellsberg had always been a hardliner in favor of the Vietnam War, but was gradually converted to a radical leftist activist. His conversion was only a shade less miraculous than St. Paul's Damascus Road experience. The entire spectrum of the New Left in the United States was the work of British intelligence M16 acting through Round Table Assets and the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS. Just as it did with all countries with a Republican base, whose policies had to be changed, LPS played a leading role, even as it does today in South Africa and South Korea. Much of IPS's activities are explained in my work IPS Revisited, published in 1990. IPS had one main function, that being to sow discord and spread disinformation resulting in chaos. One such program, aimed at America's youth, centered on drugs. Through a series of IPS fronts, acts like the stoning of Nixon's motorcade and a large number of bombings, a climate of deception was effectively created, which led a majority of Americans to believe that the United States was under threat from the KGB, the GRU, and Cuban DGI. The word went out that a lot of these imaginary agents had close ties to the Democrats through George McGovern. It was, in fact, a model disinformation campaign for which M16 is justly famous. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Nixon's closest aides had no clue as to what was happening, hence a flurry of statements emanating from the White House that East Germany, the Soviet Union, North Korea, and Cuba were training terrorists and funding their operations in the United States. I doubt whether Nixon knew very much about IPS, let alone suspected what it was doing to his presidency. We suffered the same kind of disinformation during the Gulf War when the word went out that terrorists of all stripes were about to invade the United States and blow up everything in sight. President Nixon was literally left in the dark. He didn't even know that David Young, a Kissinger pupil, was working in the basement of the White House, supervising leaks. Young was a graduate of Oxford and a longtime Kissinger associate through Round Table Assets, such as the law firm of Milbank Tweed. President Nixon was no match for the forces arrayed against him under the direction of M16 on behalf of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and hence the British royal family. About the only thing that Nixon was guilty of, insofar as Watergate is concerned, was his ignorance of what was going on all around him. When James McCord confessed to Judge John Sirica, Nixon should have been onto it like a flash that McCord was playing a double game. He ought to have challenged Kissinger about his relationship with McCord there and then. That would have thrown a spanner in the works and derailed the whole M16 Watergate operation. Nixon did not abuse his presidential powers. His crime was not defending the Constitution of the United States of America and not charging Mrs. Catherine Meyer Graham and Ben Bradley with conspiracy to commit insurrection. Mrs. Catherine Meyer. Graham's pedigree is of the most doubtful kind, as Jessica Fletcher of Murder, She Wrote would soon have discovered. But even knowing that, Mrs. Graham's controllers in the Round Table would have fought hard to keep the lid on things. The role of the Washington Post was to keep the pot boiling by one revelation after another, thereby engendering a climate of public distrust of President Nixon, even when there was not one shred of evidence to support wrongdoing by him. Yet it shows the immense power of the press, as Lippmann and Bernays had quite properly anticipated, in that Mrs. Graham, long suspected of the murder of her husband, Philip L. Graham, officially classed as suicide, should have retained any credibility at all. Other traitors who should have been indicted for insurrection and treason were Kissinger, Haig, Halperin, Ellsberg, Young, McCord, Joseph Califano, and Chomsky of IPS, and those CIA operatives who went to McCord's house and burned all of his papers. Again, it is worth repeating that Watergate, like many other operations we do not have the space to include here, demonstrated the complete control exercised over the United States by the Committee of 300. While Nixon kept company with people like Earl Warren and some mafia dons who had built Warren's house, that does not mean that he should have been disgraced over the Watergate affair. My dislike of Nixon stems from his willingness to sign the infamous ABM Treaty in 1972 and his all-too-cozy relationship with Leonid Brezhnev. One of the sorriest slip-ups of the Minority Council was its abject failure to expose the dirty role played by Intertel, the Corning Group's ugly private intelligence agency whom we have already met, who leaked a lot of Watergate material to Edward Kennedy. Private intelligence agencies like Intertel have no right to exist in the United States. They are a menace to our right to privacy and an insult to all free men everywhere. Blame must also fall on those who were supposed to protect President Nixon from the kind of steel mesh net that was thrown around him to isolate him. The intelligence personnel around Nixon were a poor lot who had no knowledge of just how thorough British intelligence operations are. Indeed, they had no inkling that Watergate was a British intelligence operation in its entirety. The Watergate plot was a coup d'etat against the United States of America, as was the murder of John F. Kennedy. Although this fact is not recognized as such today, I am confident that when all the secret papers are finally opened, history will record that 2 coups d'etats, one against Kennedy and one against Nixon, did indeed take place, and which in their wake brought the most violent rape and assault on the institutions upon which the Republic of the United States stands. The individual who most deserves the title of traitor and who is most guilty of sedition is General Alexander Haig. This desk-man office colonel, whose paper-shuffling career did not include commanding any troops in battle, was suddenly thrust upon the scene by the invisible upper-level parallel government President Nixon once described him as a man who had to ask Kissinger's permission to go to the bathroom. Haig was a product of the Round Table. He was noticed by Round Tabler Joseph Califano, one of Her Majesty's most trusted Round Tablers in the United States. Joseph Califano, legal counsel of the Democratic National Convention, had actually interviewed Alfred Baldwin, one of the plumbers, a month before the burglary took place. Califano was stupid enough to write a memorandum on his interview with Baldwin, in which he gave details of information on McCord's background and why McCord had selected Baldwin to be on the team. Even more damaging, Califano's memorandum contained full details of transcripts of wiretaps of conversations between Nixon and the Re-Election Committee, all this before the break-in occurred. Califano should have been indicted on a score of federal offenses. Instead, he got away cleanly with his criminal activity. Sanctimonious Sam Ervin refused to allow Fred Thompson, Minority Counsel, to introduce this highly damaging evidence at the Watergate hearings, on the spurious grounds that it was too speculative. On Round Table orders, Kissinger had Haig promoted from colonel to 4-star general in the most meteoric rise ever recorded in the annals of United States military history, in the course of which Haig was leapfrogged over 280 senior U.S. Army generals and high-ranking officers. During Haig's promotion, and as a result of it, 25 senior generals were forced to resign. As a reward for his treachery toward President Nixon and the United States, Haig was subsequently given the plum job of commanding general of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization forces, NATO, although he was the least qualified commander ever to hold that position. Here again, he was leapfrogged over 400 senior generals from NATO countries and the United States. When the news of his appointment reached the Soviet Armed Forces High Command, Marshal Orgakov recalled his 3 top Warsaw Pact generals from Poland and East Germany, and there was much merrymaking, clinking of glasses and quaffing of champagne until well into the night. All through Haig's tenure as commander of NATO forces, the professional elite cadre of the Soviet armed forces, men who have never been anything else but professional soldiers, held Haig in the utmost contempt and openly referred to him as the office manager of NATO. They knew that Haig owed his appointment to the RIIA and not to the United States military. But before his military promotion took him out of Washington, let it be known that Alexander Haig, in conjunction with Kissinger, all but destroyed the office of the President of the United States and its government. The chaos left by Kissinger and Haig in the wake of Watergate has never been chronicled to the best of my knowledge. On the insistence of the RIA, Haig virtually took over the management of the government of the United States after the April 1973 coup d'etat. Bringing 100 roundtable agents chosen from the Brookings Institution, Institute Policy Studies, and the Council on Foreign Relations, Haig filled the top 100 posts in Washington with men who, like himself, were beholden to a foreign power. In the ensuing debacle, the Nixon administration was torn asunder and the United States along with it. Thrusting aside the pious platitudes and posturings of defending the Constitution, Senator Sam Ervin did more to change the United States than anything President Nixon was alleged to have done, and the United States has not yet recovered from the near-mortal wound of Watergate, a committee of 300-sponsored operation conducted by the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Round Table and Hands-On M16 officers based in the United States. The way President Nixon was first isolated, surrounded by traitors, and then confused, followed to the letter the Tavistock method of gaining full control of a person according to the methodology laid down by Tavistock's chief theoretician, Dr. Kurt Lewin. I have already given details of Lewin's methodology elsewhere in this book, but in view of the textbook case of President Richard M. Nixon, I think it is worth repeating. One of the main techniques for breaking morale through a strategy of terror consists in exactly this tactic. Keep the person hazy as to where he stands and just what he may expect. In addition, if frequent vacillations between severe disciplinary measures and promises of good treatment together with the spreading of contradictory news make the cognitive structure of this situation utterly unclear, then the individual may cease even to know a particular plan would lead toward or away from his goal. Under these conditions, even those individuals who have definite goals and are ready to take risks are paralyzed by severe inner conflict in regard to what to do. Kissinger and Haig followed Tavistock training manuals to the letter. The result was a distraught, confused, frightened, and demoralized President Nixon, whose only course of action, he was told by Haig, was to resign. In 1983, I wrote 2 works, The Tavistock Institute, Sinister and Deadly, and The Tavistock Institute, Britain's Control of U.S. Policy, based upon Tavistock's secret manuals which had fallen into my hands. Tavistock Institute's methods and actions are spelled out in these 2 works. So successfully were Tavistock methods applied to unseat President Nixon that the people of this nation fully believed the calumny of lies, distortions, and set-piece contrived situations mounted by the conspirator as truth, when in fact Watergate was a diabolical lie from end to end. It is important to stress this because we have certainly not seen the last of Watergate-type operations. What were the alleged impeachable offenses committed by President Nixon and the so-called smoking gun evidence which was supposed to back up the charges? First, the smoking gun. This piece of fiction was created by Kissinger and Haig around the June 23 tape, which Haig coerced Nixon into surrendering to Leon Jaworski. Haig spent hours convincing President Nixon that this tape would sink him because it proved beyond any doubt that Nixon was guilty of serious wrongdoing and a co-conspirator in the Watergate break-in. President Nixon's first response was to tell Haig, "It's utter nonsense to make such a big deal of this." But Haig chipped away until Nixon became convinced that he could not make a successful defense before the Senate based solely on this particular June 23 tape. How had Haig accomplished his mission? Acting out a scenario prepared for him by his roundtable controllers, Haig had an unedited transcript of the smoking gun tape typed by his staff. In reality, there was nothing in the tape that President Nixon could not have explained. Sensing this, Haig then circulated his unauthorized, unedited transcript of the tape among Nixon's staunchest supporters in the House and Senate and the Republican Party high command. Peppered with smoking gun and devastating, and coming from Nixon's trusted aide, the transcript had the effect of a falcon hitting a flock of pigeons. Nixon's supporters panicked and ran for cover. Following up his sedition and insurrection, Haig summoned to his office Congressman Charles Wiggins, a staunch Nixon supporter who had agreed to lead the fight in the House to head off impeachment proceedings. In a bare-faced, blatant lie, Wiggins was informed by Haig, "The fight is lost." After that, Wiggins lost all interest in defending Nixon, believing that Nixon himself had agreed to give up. Haig then dealt with Senator Griffin, a leading supporter of the president in the Senate, in the same way. As a result of Haig's seditious, treasonous activities, Senator Griffin immediately wrote a letter to President Nixon calling upon him to resign. 3 months earlier, Round Table-controlled Institute for Policy Studies, child of James Warburg, founder and a fellow Marcus Raskin, delivered exactly the same ultimatum that President Nixon resign, using the British intelligence propaganda journal, The New York Times of May 25th, to deliver the ultimatum. The Watergate tragedy was a step in the irreversible transition to barbarism which is enveloping the United States, and which is leading us into the one-world government New World Order. The United States is now at the same place that Italy found itself when Aldo Moro tried to rescue it from created instability. With what wrongdoing was Nixon charged? John Doerr, whose brutish character was well suited to his task of bringing so-called articles of impeachment against the president, was the author and finisher of one of the most far-reaching illegal domestic surveillance counterintelligence operations ever run in the United States. Heading the Interdepartmental Intelligence Unit, IDIU, Doerr garnered information from every conceivable agency of the federal government, including the Internal Revenue Service. The program was linked to the Institute for Policy Studies. One of the highlights of John Doerr's career was to provide the CIA, which is forbidden by law to engage in domestic surveillance, with 10,000, 12,000 names of citizens he suspected as political dissidents, for further investigation. On July 18, 1974, this great upholder of the law, with measured pomposity, delivered the charges against President Nixon, which episode was nationally televised. There was not a single piece of evidence that Nixon had done anything impeachable. Indeed, Doerr's pathetic litany of Nixon's alleged crimes were so trivial that it is a wonder the proceedings went beyond this point. Income tax fiddling, unauthorized bombing of Cambodia, and a vague abuse of power charge that would never have stuck in a court of law was the best that Doerr could do. The United States was as unstable as it would ever be when President Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. Nowhere more so than in our economic and fiscal policies. In 1983, the international bankers met in Williamsburg, Virginia, to work out a strategy to prepare the United States for a total disintegration of its banking system. This planned event was to stampede the U.S. Senate into accepting control of our monetary and fiscal policies by the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Dennis Weatherstone of Morgan Guarantee on Wall Street stated that he was convinced this was the only way for the United States to save itself. The proposal was endorsed by the Ditchley Group, which had its beginning in May of 1982 at Ditchley Park in London. On January 11 L 983, this alien group met in Washington, D.C., in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Act, and conspired to overthrow the sovereignty of the United States of America in its monetary and financial freedom. The United States Attorney General knew of the meeting and its purpose. Instead of charging members of the group with conspiracy to commit a federal crime, he simply looked the other way. Under the above-mentioned acts, proof of a conspiracy is all that is needed for a felony conviction, and there was ample evidence that a conspiracy did indeed take place. But as the Ditchley Foundation had met at the request of the Royal Institute for International Affairs and was hosted by the Round Table, no one in the Justice Department had the courage to take action as required by those who had sworn to uphold the laws of the United States. The Ditchley plan to usurp control of the fiscal and monetary policies of the United States was the brainchild of Sir Harold Lever, a strong backer of Zionism and a close confidant of members of the British royal family and a member of the Committee of 300. Sir Harold Lever was a director of the giant Unilever conglomerate, an important committee of 300 company. Lever's plan called for the IMF's influence to be broadened so that it could influence central banks of all nations, including the U.S., and guide them into the hands of a one-world government bank. This was considered a vital step in bringing about a situation where the IMF would become the supreme arbiter of world banking. The ultra-secret January meeting was preceded by an earlier meeting in October 1982 and was attended by representatives of 36 of the world's top banks who met at the New York Vista Hotel. Security for the October 26th, 27th seminar was as tight as anything ever seen in the Big Apple. This earlier Ditchley Group meeting also violated United States law. Addressing the meeting, Sir Harold Lever said it was essential that national sovereignty, as an archaic hangover, must be ended before the year 2000. The United States will soon have to realize that it will be no better than any third world country when the IMF takes control, said Sir Harold. It was later reported to the delegates that plans to appoint the IMF as the controller of United States fiscal policies were being readied to bring before the United States Senate by the year 2000. Rimmer de Vries, speaking for Morgan Guarantee, said it was high time that the United States became a member of the Bank of International Settlements. There must be a reconsideration of U.S. hesitancy over the past 50 years, de Vries declared. Some British and German bankers, fearing possible violations of U.S. law, said that the Ditchley Group is nothing but a committee to iron out exchange rate problems. Felix Rohatyn also spoke of the great need to change U.S. banking laws so that the IMF could play a greater role in this country. Rohatyn headed Lazard Frères, a club of Rome Bank and part of the Eagle Star Group, which we have already met. Roundtablers William Ogden and Werner Stang spoke enthusiastically in support of surrendering U.S. fiscal sovereignty to the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements. Delegates representing the Alpha Ranking Group, a P2 Freemasonry bank, said the United States must be forced to surrender to the higher authority of a world bank before any progress toward the New World Order could be made. On January 8, 1983, before their big meeting on January 11 the 1st, Hans Vogel, a leading Club of Rome member, was received at the White House. President Ronald Reagan had invited George Shultz, Caspar Weinberger, George Kennan, and Lane Kirkland to be present at his meeting with Vogel, who explained to President Reagan what the aims and objectives of the Ditchley Group were. From that day, President Reagan did an about-face and worked with the Committee of 300's various agencies to advance the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of International Settlements as the authority on U.S. domestic and foreign monetary policies. The invisible government of the Committee of 300 has put tremendous pressure on America to change its ways, for the worse. America is the last bastion of freedom, and unless our freedoms are taken away from us, progress toward a one-world government will be considerably slowed. Such an undertaking as a one-world government is a massive one, requiring a great deal of skill, organizing abilities, control of governments and their policies. The only organization that could possibly have undertaken this mammoth task with any hope of success is the Committee of 300, and we have seen just how far it has come toward total success. Above all, the battle is a spiritual one. Unfortunately, the Christian churches have become little more than social clubs run by the infinitely evil World Council of Churches, WCC, whose beginnings lie not in Moscow but in the city of London, as we see from the chart at the end of the book, which gives the structure of the One World Government Church. This body was set up in the 1920s to serve as a vehicle for one world government policies, and stands as a monument to the long-range planning capabilities of the Committee of 300. Another corrupt body similar in structure and design to the WCC is the Union of Concerned Scientists, set up by the Trilateral Commission and funded by the Carnegie Endowment Fund, the Ford Foundation, and Aspen Institute. This is the group that has led the fight to prevent the United States from mounting an effective deterrent against Soviet cosmospheres, space-based laser beam weapons which can destroy selected targets in the United States or elsewhere from outer space. The United States SDI program was designed to counter the threat posed by Soviet cosmospheres, a threat which still exists in spite of the assurances that communism is dead. Soviet spokesman Georgy Arbatov told a meeting of the Union of Concerned Scientists that it is important for them to oppose the SDI program because if the SDI program became operational, it will be a military catastrophe. Year after year, the Union of Concerned Scientists has opposed every budget which included funding for the vital SDI program, until by the end of 1991, there is not even enough money to fund further research still required, let alone place the system in orbit. The Union of Concerned Scientists is run by the Royal Institute for International Affairs and is heavily infiltrated with M16 British intelligence agents. There is not one single aspect of life in America that is not watched over, steered in the right direction, manipulated and controlled by the invisible government of the Committee of 300. There is not one elected official or political leader that is not subject to its rule. No one thus far has got away with defying our secret rulers, who do not hesitate to make a horrible example of anyone, including the President of the United States of America. From 1776, when Jeremy Bentham and William Petty, the Earl of Shelburne, fresh from the triumph of the French Revolution which they planned and ran, were drafted by the British Crown to bring their combined experience to bear against the colonists, to 1812, when the British sacked and burned Washington, destroying secret documents that would have exposed the treason being worked against the young United States of America, to the Watergating of President Nixon and assassination of President Kennedy, the hand of the Committee of 300 is clearly visible. This book is an attempt to open the eyes of the American people to this terrible truth. We are not an independent nation, nor can we ever be, as long as we are ruled by an invisible government, the Committee of 300.